Hello, welcome to the Middle East Forum's webcast and webinar and podcast series. Good grief. I'm Cliff Smith, the Washington Project Director of the Middle East Forum, and today I have a very special guest in Professor Robert Kaufman at Pepperdine University. Hello, Professor Kaufman, how are you doing?
Fine, how are you, Cliff?
Doing great. Full disclosure, I am a former student of Dr. Kaufman, and he's also indirectly responsible for me working at the Middle East Forum. He brought Middle East Forum's President Daniel Pipes to teach at Pepperdine in 2007 when I was a student there. I took then Professor Pipes' class, and 9 years later, it turned into a job at the Middle East Forum. Worked out pretty well. Professor Kaufman is an accomplished academic, has a PhD from Columbia University and a JD from Georgetown. He's the author of 4 books and countless articles. He wrote the definitive biography of Senator Henry M. Scoop Jackson and has written several books about various doctrines that drive foreign policy in different presidential administrations. In other words, what are the overarching goals and philosophies that drive their foreign policy decisions and how those fit into our larger political framework. So today we'll be discussing that is conservative and liberal approaches to the Middle East in the past and discuss how these might apply to events going forward. I'll ask him some broad questions as well as perhaps a few questions that were raised by some of his writings, and we'll try to get to some questions from the audience in the end. Anyhow, with that introduction, Professor, can you give us a brief take on what as you see as broad liberal and conservative approaches to the Middle East in the past, say, 40 years?
Those approaches have evolved over time, Cliff. Before the new politics wing of the Vietnam War era took over the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party was in some ways much more proactive in the Middle East. And although both parties had a pro-Israel element, before 1968, I think there was more reservation about aligning with Israel in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. That's changed substantially. There were several inflection points, 1 Reagan, 2 Carter. And now the meaning of liberal and conservative in the Middle East is such that the Republicans are the pro-Israel party and the Democrats are increasingly the anti-Israel party. And that's a fundamental change over the last 40 years. Within the Republican Party, since 1980, there were 2 main strains contending. One was to look at the Middle East through the lens of political realism, with Israel accepted, largely depreciating any type of regime change as a goal because of the conditions in the Middle East. That changed under Bush 43, whatever the merits thereof, with Iraq turning out not the way the second Bush administration intended. There's now a high degree of convergence among Republicans about what we should do in the Middle East, where it ranks on our priorities, who our friends are, who our associates are. And there's a consensus in the Republican Party that enemy number 1 is Iran and the most reliable partner is Israel. So there's really a clarity in the Republican Party today that wasn't always the case over the last 40 years on what our orientation toward the Middle East ought to be.
And how do you, and what is the corollary Democratic view of that, would you say?
I think that the Democratic Party's default position on the Middle East is, unless very close to Obama's. Instead of Iran being the major problem in the region, it's the Arab-Israeli conflict and the unspoken premise, sometimes it is spoken, of an increasing number of Democrats from the progressive left, is that Israel is the problem. And within the Democratic Party, almost exhibiting the definition of insanity attributed to Einstein, it isn't, but it's attributed to him. Biden has returned to the insanity of viewing Iran as a possible partner to flip in the Middle East, with the Iran nuclear deal as the centerpiece of that misguided strategy. So on Iran and Israel, there's a fundamental difference. And there's also a fundamental difference, Cliff, on domestic policy that bears significantly on the Middle East, namely energy policy. Especially under Trump, the Republicans are the party committed to unleashing the free market to exploit the full extent possible our vast reservoir of energy, which under the Trump administration literally had put us on the cusp of being a world's energy superpower. The Biden administration has cast that away, in my view, by returning to Obama's priorities of the Green New Deal and climate change, the consequence of which is that it has paradoxically made us much more dependent on Middle Eastern regimes that we don't want to be dependent on, because we don't have the luxury that we had by the end of the Trump administration of energy independence. That's not just a problem for the Middle East, Cliff. It's one of the problems dealing with Putin right now. And inexplicably, Biden has filled Putin's coffers, Iranian coffers, and actually hurt the environment, because if you compare the policies, the green policies of the Republicans at their caricatured worst versus Russia and Iran, there is no logic other than blind ideology in sacrificing energy independence on multiple fronts. And that's a fundamental difference.
One area I would notice I agree with your broad way of framing this. One thing that would seem to be somewhat of an outlier to me is you could sort of debate how Democratic and Republican administrations have handled this, but especially in terms of Congress, one outlier is that, and I think this is demonstrably true, especially the past few years, is that Democrats have been much more willing to criticize Turkey and Erdogan's move to authoritarianism, towards a more Islamist direction, away from more secular governance, towards more supporting terrorist networks and so on and so forth. Trump seemed to like Erdogan. Obama, to a certain degree, did too. I think Trump was a little bit more so. But certainly from a congressional point of view, it's I would say demonstrably true that Democrats have been much harder on Turkey than Republicans have been. What do you think's driving that?
One, I think that's true rhetorically, although I push back a bit, Cliff, on the Obama. In my book on Obama, Obama said that Erdogan, I quote, and it comes from Fareed Zakaria, not Fox, is my favorite leader. And remember that when Obama went abroad for his infamous apology tour at the beginning of his presidency, he began with Turkey. I actually think if there's teeth to the Democratic disdain for Turkey, and I think it's more rhetorical than real, I wrote a piece where I argued, and there were people from the former Bush administration, 43, like Jed Babin, making this case, that Turkey does not belong in NATO. It's no longer an ally, it's an adversary. Victor Davis Hanson makes that same case. And for Trump, I think this was one of the deficiencies of his otherwise relatively successful policy in the Middle East compared to his predecessor. He downplayed the significance of regime type and ideology to an excessive extent. And in that case, he saw Turkey as a counterweight rather than evaluating Turkey based on how its internal dynamics would affect its external behavior. Turkey's no longer an ally by my estimation. And to the extent that the Democrats really mean that, rather than just virtue signaling, I'd be delighted, but I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I think it's how the Biden administration is handling it is an open question. That's you got a point there. I would definitely agree with you. I will note one thing. Just since we're talking about Obama's foreign policy for the time being, it is a source of pride for me that in your book on Obama's doctrine, you footnote an article I wrote concerning President Sisi after he toppled the Muslim Brotherhood former president. I called it dictatorships and double standards redux, and I criticized the Obama administration for removing foreign aid from Egypt at the moment that Sisi overthrew Mohamed Morsi. But I wondered if you wanted to discuss for a second sort of how the dictatorships and double standards way of looking at things works in the context of the Middle East.
Well, it has great power in the Middle East. People have misunderstood that article as originally Jeane Kirkpatrick expressing indifference to freedom. It was absolutely the opposite. Her case was that when there is not a viable democratic alternative, and in the Middle East, that's been exceedingly rare, an authoritarian regime that is pro-American, or at least not anti-American, is the lesser moral and geopolitical evil, not only in the immediate case, but also in the long term. These regimes have the capacity to reform. Witness South Korea's evolution, or Taiwan, whereas these left-wing regimes have to collapse and there's no plausible theory of reform. And the Obama administration's misguided policy toward Egypt almost replicated Carter's toward Iran, misreading the situation and misreading the Muslim Brotherhood. Obama did not get, and I'm not sure he cared, whether the election in Egypt that yielded the Muslim Brotherhood was like Nazi Germany in 1932, one election, one time, for the purpose of eliminating elections forevermore. And that framework, Cliff, especially when the Bush doctrine's ambitious agenda for transforming the Middle East proved a bridge too far, I think as much based on our lack of political will, but that's water under the bridge. That way of looking at things, the lesser evil, is especially appropriate in the Middle East, where for the time being, Israel accepted, the freedom option is going to be rather limited. And I think that logic of yours that recaptures Jeane Kirkpatrick and applies it compellingly to the situation in the 21st century explains things such as the Abraham Accords. And it also explains why, despite understandable misgivings, Saudi Arabia right now is the lesser evil to Iran. And we should applaud the Abraham Accords and the quasi-rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, rather than deplore it based on the logic of your essay, borrowing from Kirkpatrick, and the logic of the lesser evil. John Kennedy put it very well with regard to the Dominican Republic. He said his democracy was his first choice, but he'd take a dictator if the more likely outcome of the choice before him was the third choice of an anti-American, pro-Soviet totalitarian. And I think you captured that logic well, and that logic applies with greater salience, probably than any other region in the world, to the Middle East.
You touched on something I was going to ask you about next, and that is the Abraham Accords. I was looking through some of your old writings, and of course, in your book on Scoop Jackson, you discussed sort of you had Arabists that saw Israel as the problem, as you mentioned earlier, and you mentioned that while they had different tactical approaches, both Nixon and Kissinger, as well as Jackson, basically thought that if I read you correctly, that the U.S. by being pro-Israel could actually gain greater benefits in the region, and that Israel was a more useful ally than a problem. And it was Carter, more or less, that wanted to make a full land for peace deal as a comprehensive settlement in a way that ended up being dashed with Egypt making peace with Israel under Carter, ironically. So my question is the Abraham Accords we've recently seen, and as you mentioned, the de facto behind the scenes collaboration between Israel and Saudi Arabia, is that sort of the end result of this debate, of that side winning this debate? And also, how have liberal and conservative policy trends made that more difficult in the past few decades, or easier?
I would see it, Cliff, just a little bit differently. I wouldn't equate Nixon and Kissinger with the Trump administration on the issue of the link between Israel and Middle East peace. Nixon did have what I'd call an instrumental view of Israel, in that he believed that a pro-American Israel that was successful on the battlefield was an essential ally or quasi-ally in the Cold War. But he didn't have a deep emotional commitment to Israel. And also Nixon's defense of Israel in many ways was conditional on the conditions of the Cold War. So Nixon and Kissinger, I think out of pessimism, and Nixon out of strategic calculation, accepted the basic framework of a two-state solution and saw Israel for the time being as in America's interest. But Nixon would have been willing, I think wrongly, to put in a different circumstance a lot more pressure on Israel in a post-Cold War era. Trump is a fundamental distinction that emanates from Reagan, but Reagan didn't bring it to full fruition. Trump has abandoned the idea of a disinterested mediator. What Trump is saying, Israel is our ally and our priority vis-a-vis the Palestinians and other entities in the region, and the region has to get used to it. And what Trump did was call the bluff of generations of Arabists who warned that if you moved the capital to Jerusalem, if you didn't focus on the Palestinians as the key variable of stability, you'd have absolute chaos. And what's happened is it is the reverse, that by taking Jerusalem off the table, until Biden, I think, will put it on again, it's snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, everybody adjusted to the reality rather than the dire prognostications of the Arabists, which was actually their policy preference in the thin veil of their counterfeit version of necessity. So I see Trump's move to align the United States with Israel as a fundamental shift in the type of framework we pursued during the Cold War. Not only fundamental, I think Trump, for all of his warts, deserves tremendous credit for that. Let me add too that Trump's decision to move the embassy in Jerusalem, in my view, was a reverse inflection point. It was the opposite of Obama's cave-in in Syria. It was the opposite of Biden's cave-in in Afghanistan. By fulfilling that promise, I think Trump sent a signal, and a salutary one, to the rest of the world that he meant what he said and said what he meant. And I do think that's one of the reasons for all of the loose rhetoric of his on Putin, that Putin didn't try what he's trying now. And China did not fly more than 200 sorties into Taiwanese airspace, because Trump's move of the embassy to Jerusalem had positive resonance not only in the Middle East, but in other regions, just as the Obama-Biden cave-ins have had negative repercussions, not just regionally, but globally.
All right, we'll ask one more question, then we'll get to audience questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box. We already have a few, but we can get some more. One other thing that I'll mention about something you wrote once, you, of course, have been very outspoken that you're a big admirer of Ronald Reagan. However, you did critique his judgment on certain issues related to terrorist networks. His actions in Lebanon, for example, you wrote, helped us get to the point where certain of our enemies, bin Laden and so on, saw us as the great but decadent Satan that could, tuck its tail and leave quickly. And of course, you criticized Clinton for similar failures, such as in Somalia, doing similar things. Do you think that Reagan's approach differed materially from Clinton's? Were these like momentary lapses in judgment, or was this part of a broader misunderstanding that both of them shared?
I think the context is different, which makes Reagan not correct, but his overall approach more successful. Really, Cliff, based on the logic of your essay on Sisi, namely that when Reagan became president, the Soviet Union was the main threat. Europe was the main theater. East Asia ranked second, and the Middle East third. And any type of freedom agenda was way back on the list. And while I think sentimentality intervened on Reagan's view of terror, the substance of his administration's policy toward the Iran-Iraq war, which Henry Kissinger expressed very well, it's a shame both sides couldn't lose, basically was a correct framework with terror as the negative asterisk where his sentimentality overwhelmed what otherwise I think was a strong, sound strategic judgment under the circumstances. President Clinton had more discretion because at the end of the Cold War, no thanks to him, he inherited a unipolar decade that gave him far more leeway not to make the types of misjudgments that Reagan made. When Reagan pulled out of Lebanon, I think that had negative repercussions the way it happened. He had other major things on the table. The deployment of the Euro missiles, SDI, that were much more fundamental. Clinton's Somalia episode and other things, I think were more discretionary, but that said, I think that both parties, as with China, have some responsibility in making mistakes previously that misread the dynamic and made it worse.
Now on to audience questions. We have quite a few. I'll ask two at the same time because I think they're interrelated. Michael Steinman asks, what is Biden's motivation for a treaty with Iran? Quite similar to the one prior under Obama. And William Wolf asks, it seems like Israel will have to destroy Iran's ability to make atomic weapons. Why did they not do so while Trump was still in office? So, I mean, I think you can feel free to speak to either of those, but there's kind of an overarching question here. And that is basically, sort of where are we on a new Iran deal, and sort of how have the different administrations' approaches to Iran sort of gotten us where we are, and also how they have reacted to it. In other words, how have the Israelis acted and Iran acted to those policies that got us where we are?
Although it's hard to believe based on objective evidence, and Henry Kissinger criticized the analogy in a joint article with George Shultz opposing the Obama-Iran deal. The Obama administration evidently believed that they could flip Iran the way Nixon and Kissinger flipped China. And Obama's policy toward Iran that culminated in this Iran deal, which I call, not flatteringly in an editorial I wrote, Obama's Munich, was part of a policy where Obama came to office believing that the fundamental problem in the world was what J. William Fulbright called the arrogance of American power. So consider the outreach to Iran the same as his reset with Russia, his embrace of China's rise, and his belief that we, and by extension our allies, had been the problem. And so Obama's view, which Biden has revived, is that this is the best mechanism to recalibrate, one of their favorite words, the political alignments in the Middle East in our favor. I think that was delusional then and delusional now. But if you look at the Biden administration, with some positive distinction, the equivalent of being tougher than Obama is like being the best looking person in the physics department. Biden's provisional national security statement at least admitted that China was a competitor. Obama would never admit it. This is Obama 2.0. And the mentality on Iran, if I may, reflects his and Obama's and his core constituencies' view on China. President Obama's presidential memoirs, which I read for professional reason as punishment, said on page 339, and this is published in November of 2020, even after COVID, Obama said, "I don't regard China as a threat, and it will become one only if we overreact to it." This mentality is, with some honorable exceptions, Rush Doshi, who wrote a fine book on China, this general attitude is pervasive in general, and it affects their calculation of the Iran deal. So if you want to understand Biden on Iran, I think the shortcut to it is it's the same logic of Obama's. It's Obama 2.0 on that issue.
And do you have any answer to why Israel has waited too long?
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do. If you look at the geography of Iran, the sites, the Zagros mountain range, the type of weapons that you need, Israel would do that only in desperation, and the most reliable way to do it is to have the United States do it. I'm not saying that if I were an Israeli leader, I would rule out the possibility, but it would be a more dire calculation because of A, the difficulty of doing it, and B, it's only the United States that has the array of capabilities that would have a chance really to degrade for a significant period of time Iran's nuclear capability.
Henry Mahan asks, these discussions on foreign policy are terribly important. The American public seems to have no interest on the subject. Can international issues be made more pressing for Americans? And I will add to that, the interesting thing in that is given, I think there is some truth to what he's saying. Why do you think that administrations seem so touchy about their base's view on foreign policy, given that I would argue Americans don't vote that much on foreign policy?
Well, unlike the 1980s, Cliff, the progressives are a problem. And the fundamental problem, but as Lincoln said, quoting another fellow well-known, Jesus, a house divided against itself can't stand. Even the Republican Party, which is the healthier of the two parties when it comes to conservative internationalism in general and applied to the Middle East, not all as well. There is a significant vocal, I'd say, quasi-isolationist way. Not the substance of Trump's policy, but some of the tone of it. The Tucker Carlsons and the Jesse Waters of the world. This more applies to Ukraine and Europe. They have their head in an area associated with a colonoscopy when it comes to America's global responsibility, and their sanguine assumption that history is demolished, that Europeans or East Asians without us have the capability, and in Europe's case, the will, to form an effective counterbalancing coalition. So there is a deep problem that I think is in both parties, with the Democrats having a much more severe, pervasive variant of it, that has affected us. One of the problems we have right now, and your questioner is right, is the greatest enemy in many ways is ourselves. Our enemies look at us. We can't defend our borders, or won't. Our cities are descending into Hobbesian chaos, where life is nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. We've sacrificed being an energy superpower, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. We've cut the defense budget at the very time when, as the fine scholar and a commentator Walter Russell we have to spend at least 4% on the defense on the GDP. Highly achievable, easily bearable. It's freedom insurance, and yet there seems to be a deep reluctance to do that. And that problem is not just the Democrats, but also some dynamics in the Republican Party as well. So my question, I wrote an essay on this, on COVID, will China win? With COVID, so far they have. And what's really shocking is that in the past, something like a weaponization of COVID that has killed by more people in the United States than the Civil War, our most destructive war in history. Usually these inflection points have roused us from our slumber. The sinking of the Maine, German U-boat warfare, Pearl Harbor, the Czech coup of 1948 with Jan Masaryk being defenestrated. In Prague, thrown out the 17th story of a building in Prague. 9/11, they've galvanized us. What's really chilling, and I think your questioner is onto something, is that look at the election of 2020. There was almost no focus on the gathering danger of China, which is our greatest existential threat. And this lack of concern has extended to Ukraine and also to Iran. It's narcissism, it's dangerous, and I wonder what it will take. I have a piece coming out, I hope, for Victor Davis Hanson, hoping and wondering whether this announcement of the equivalent of a Sino-Russian alliance will shock us into strategic and moral sanity. I'm wondering what it will take, and I think, if I may take the liberties of your fine questioner, I'm hoping, as he's hoping, that we finally reached what I would call the Popeye the Sailor moment, when we've had all we can stand, we can't stand anymore, and we come out with the metaphorical can of spinach. It can't happen a moment too soon, and what I worry about is that we have 3 more years of Biden, and I see at least the hope in the Republican Party to galvanize us to the urgency of conservative internationalism with all its implications. But I see no corrective mechanism, and I hope I'm wrong, in the Democratic parties. There are no Scoop Jacksons, Pat Moynahans, Fritz Hollings, the types of Democrats, Sam Nunn, that in the past were the material for an effective bipartisan consensus.
And with that, I think we'll have to go. We're already running over time. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. And thanks
for having me, Cliff.
Thanks for all of our viewers. And you can join us next week for more. Talk to y'all later.
Thanks again.